Welcome back to this special report on the coronavirus pandemic. This Friday night, we are tackling all of your financial questions because we know there are a lot of them out there. Norm Champ is helping us out with that big time. So let's get to Susan, who I know is on the line, calling from Manhattan. Susan, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. I'm listening in online.
Oh, amazing. I was wondering. I was like, this is great. How are you doing?
I'm good. I just had a question about my savings. So things are already pretty tight, but I do have a little bit of savings that I've been, saving up over the last few years. And I don't know, I'm kind of torn, like, should I be putting more money into my savings? Should I be using my savings if I need it? I'm just not sure exactly what to do with it.
Such a battle.
Yeah, such a great question.
Yeah.
I think the first question is, do you feel like your savings give you enough of an emergency fund? So one of the first things to think about is having an emergency fund, which is equivalent to roughly 6 months expenses that you can have on hand so that you can ride out a job loss, like unfortunately so many people are experiencing right now. So it takes, in normal times, it takes around 4 to 6 months for most people to find a new job. So one of the things to always look out for is, do I have an emergency fund that is substantial enough that if I lose my job, I'm okay for, call it up to 6 months, so that you don't have to worry about losing your home or, some of the terrible things that people go through. So I would evaluate your savings and say, okay, do I have enough for 6 months expenses? If you're beyond that, then a couple other things to think about. If you have any debt, so particularly credit card debt or other consumer debt, typically that debt's a very high interest rate, far higher than your savings. So think about whether you need to get rid of any debt. Part of this sort of, my subtitle of surviving any crisis is to try to build your own balance sheet, kind of your own net worth, right? So assets in excess of liabilities. So if you have any debt, I would think about that and think about whether you want to get any debt out of the way. If you don't have debt and your savings exceed your emergency fund level, then the next thing to think about is how to do some very cautious investing, because the one problem with savings account is it's going to bear a very, very low interest rate. We've been in a very low interest rate now for really 12 years since the '08 crisis. So if you have excess funds that you think you could put to work in some very cautious investing, then it might be time to think about taking something out of there and putting it into, and I would say just very plain vanilla kind of stock and bond mutual fund type things, very tightly regulated by the government, so you're not taking any risk of fraud or anything like that. But consider whether you want to try to get a better return on that money. Now, might you have to use it? For sure, that's what an emergency fund is for. And in these tough times that so many people are experiencing, this is the time an emergency fund comes in handy to make sure you don't have to suffer any immediate distress. But if you've got enough in there for that, then I would consider thinking, about some investing, because the kinds of returns you can get are much higher than you can get with a savings account. The other thing to think about is if you're employed and you have access to a 401k at an employer, or if you have an individual retirement account, which is outside an employer, that's a great place to start some investing because it's tax deferred until basically you're 70, which is a ways down the road. And so that gives you a long timeline to invest money in your tax-free accounts, your tax deferred accounts.
Lot to think about, but all things, there's a lot of aspects, especially when you're making a financial decision. There's a lot to think about, and there's a lot of kind of analyzing and thinking about what's important at this time, but also thinking ahead. So you really covered all of that. So thank you, Norm. And thank you to Susan for calling in, because I'm sure there's so many people in that same boat. You're scared to touch it, but also, it's tough times. So thank you for that, Susan. And I do want to get to a social media question because we get so many of those as well. So this one one is from Jamie, who said, I applied for a 90-day mortgage deferment and was approved, only to find out I must pay it all in full on July 1st. So this isn't helpful. It will put people further in debt. And can't banks just be made to put these payments at the end of my mortgage? I know this is something so many people have kind of been begging for and wondering about. Is there any hope that this decision might be made, you think?
So, I think obviously, it's so interesting, right? Because so much of what we had, even the stimulus, some of the unemployment and the stimulus checks, it was all sort of this short term kind of 60 to 90 day thing, right? Kind of getting us out to July 1. They put off taxes till July 15th, right? So now, unfortunately, right, it's looking like the impact of this is going to be much longer than that. We're at 14.7% unemployment, which is a huge number. In February, we were setting records for the lowest unemployment in American history, and now we're rivaling the worst, as you mentioned, back to the Depression. So what I would suggest on this one is, I don't know if there's going to be a regulatory, command to add it to the end of the mortgage. I would talk to your bank, though. I know banks can be a little impersonal, but I do think, it's always worth trying to have a dialogue with them and, try to see if you can talk to them about whether there is any chance they would consider that. Might they consider, if it's 3 months of payments, would they consider putting one to the end and, something better than none? So I do think this is the same with credit cards, right? When people get behind, and it's worth at least a discussion. They usually have dedicated people who are on those issues. So I'd suggest approaching them and see if there's any luck there.
That's really good advice. And, they should know, obviously, this is a really tough time. So just having that conversation to at least ask, you never know. We're going to be right back. Stay with us.